Virtual Philosophy Network is an international network of meetup philosophy groups collaborating on online events such as discussions and seminars and reading groups. Our goals are to encourage the study of philosophy and to broaden the public's access to philosophy. Over the last year, we have facilitated online discussions and seminars, and we have provided a platform for speakers to reach an audience interested in philosophy. For more information, please visit virtualphilosophynetwork.com. Had to say that. And we are all very, very, very pleased, excited, and encouraged and enthused by having Dr. Kenneth R. Smith, who is here to present his paper, Contra Kant. This is a different take on different understanding and assessment of Kant. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss when the reading is done. So I'll just stop talking now and I'll bring it over to Dr. Kenneth Smith. Kenneth, welcome to the group.
Thank you. The earliest version of this paper, Contra Kant, was actually, I think, presented at the University of North Texas in Denton. And I may be misremembering that. It might have been the Dallas Philosophers Forum, but it doesn't matter. That version would have made this one completely unrecognizable. So, Contra Kant 1, a quote first from Richard Wagner: "To be German means to carry a matter on for its own sake." And from Edward Dahlberg: "Conscience is various, brooding, and chameleon, and is not a law any more than are the works of Shakespeare or Keats." The most monumental shadows across the 19th century to come were cast by the world shapers Kant and Goethe. This present paper cannot deal with much more than rough shapes of the new vision of humanity and civilization unleashed by Kant, only to be largely disemboweled by the overriding issues of dialectic and existentialism. 1. Kant. In Kant, Enlightenment rationalism crested. It is a common accolade of his achievement to say that he effected a, quote, Copernican revolution in ethics, a heliocentric system in which the sun of reason assumed the authoritative and strategic centripetal position formerly occupied by human nature or customary social order or even laws of natural existence. In spite of so formidably reconceiving the fundamental ordering forms of human rationality, Kant was an inauspicious and provincial individual who set out to defend the essential principles of ethics and the possibility of moral responsibility and free will from encroaching menaces along two warfronts in modernity's gathering culture storms. 1. Humean psychologism, or skeptical, cynical conventionalism, as a clear prefiguration of bourgeois-capitalist, amoral, or nihilist, i.e. self-interested materialism. And 2. Newtonian physical determinism. These two taken as massing and erosive tides against the remnants, if any, of the classical European patrimony of Hellenic humanism, Judeo-Christian values, and the entire ethos of rational order known as individualism. The two barbarizing and brutalizing tides in modernity generally have lately been rending one another apart in the culture wars between American Republican plutocratism and the apolitical objectivity of the various sciences, with megalo-Mammon leaving the fruited tree of knowledge itself much the worse off. Radical strokes were made by Kant to restructure the determination in the latter part of the 18th century of what is rationally cogent and obligatory, that is, to stave off the morally devastating tsunamis of proto-nihilistic bourgeois corruptivism and scientific determinism, itself another species of crypto-nihilism. Kant's countermoves against Humean psychologism or cynicism on the one hand consisted in architecting an impersonal and impartial method of stringent individual self-criticism, testing any proposed moral action or motive against a universalist standard by which a moral agent had to self-measure any actions. And Kant's countermove against Newtonian materialist determinist causal explanation, on the other hand, rigorously demarcated the realm of empirically ascertained phenomena, over against which a domain of noumena was maintained by Kantian ethics for matters not outwardly experienceable or sensible, thus strictly not known, but only rationally understood. For rational intelligence, the empirical or phenomenal ego has no normative or imperative force, that is, no moral evaluative weight. It is only in relation to the philosophical optics of a transcendent moral evaluator or judge that our subjective self raises properly and strictly moral issues for or to itself. Kant discredits issues of shame and social conformism a priori as counterfeit moral matters. True or valid morality, morality strictly taken, is a function of rational autonomous ego or self-relating subjectivity, not a triangulation upon oneself gained via third parties. Kant's whole system of understanding includes a doctrine of categories or rational concepts, an epistemology, a theory of aesthetic judgment, etc. Although essentially a rationalist himself, Kant set out to circumscribe the rationalist metaphysics of his own and the previous century. The proper or valid function of rationality for him lies in coordinating evidence mediated for us by experience and our senses. A strictly a priori metaphysics he did not regard as feasible, because nothing can truly be said to be known within a merely a priori procedure. But in matters of moral principles and our own moral core, we have no choice but to seek the guidance of what can be understood a priori or intrinsically from the logic and principles that reason per se ordains for itself. Not the rest of his theories, but rather his radical purge of traditional and customary aspects of ethics or morality, and his severe demands of self-critique in these fields are what made his thinking so contagious and so daunting across antagonistic lines of party, sect, nationality, and culture. This is the top of page 3. It is hard indeed to believe works as dry and distanced as Kant's could have set off a wildfire of revolutionizing perspectives, and truly, Kant struggled to disinfect his writing of any emotional or subjective impact. Between the first and second edition of his Critique of Pure Reason, he scrupulously purged figures of speech and other appeals to imagination to leave a stainless steel argument more in the vein of Spinoza and Leibniz, the archetypally rational style of thinking and writing in more geometrico, after the manner of geometric proof as a paradigm of deduction. All throughout Europe, it was not just the post-Kantian 19th century existentialists, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, but Kant too, who produced what Nietzsche would call an idea quake. But in Kant's case, it was no less compelling for being forbiddingly austere, even antiseptically so. Excuse me. Kant's systemic method and the burden of his argument not only make the moral ought or duty into a matter to be comprehended, but indeed also cast an existential urgency on the reader's commitment to duty, a wholesale question of integrity, self-coherence, authenticity, and sanity. Kant's paean to duty is a concise manifesto of the very anchorage of the human order of life and thought. Quote, "Duty, thou sublime and mighty name that dost embrace nothing charming or insinuating, but requirest submission, and yet seekest not to move the will by threatening, but only holdest forth a law, which of itself finds entrance into the mind and gains reluctant reverence. What origin is worthy of thee? Unquote. Humans as rational beings have an interest in informing themselves with the laws and implications of rationality, while at the same time they must shun every extrinsic motivation, the fear of God, the desire to be well thought of by their fellows, etc., that might induce them to succumb to rationality for the sake of impulses or compulsions alien to such an essence. The ancient Greek ethicists might argue that Kant has so puritanized duty as to castrate it of any and every worldly, natural, or human power of command or seduction. But this is the stark profile of a strictly deontological morality, evacuated of every other mode of morality save the binding force of duty. Kant's thought world posed a naked and uncompromising revelation of what the principle of reason most centrally had to mean for moderns, as the very seat of social, political, legal, moral, and in some ways religious self-understanding. See his Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. America did undergo a phase of Hegelian religious cults, but never the ice-cold shower by whose means Kant cured the empiricist and psychologizing rhetoric of Anglo-Saxon thinkers, not just because it was never exposed to the Kantian anti-venom against irrationalism, but for other profound and apparently structural reasons. America has privileged its vitiating racism, sexism, xenophobia, etc., to proliferate unchecked for generations. This is the top of page 4, I believe. The phenotype of these dogmas, i.e., the fetish or cult of privilege per se, or idolatrous narcissist self-interest, has long taken root as a pseudo-faith or incestuous mythos. As mentioned, these humorous irrationalisms of egocentrism and mindless custom were put to a stringent test by Kant. The rationally rigorous self-coherence of intended or proposed moral programs, everything to which one might suppose one was entitled as absolute right, had to be subjected to a universalizability test. Could a member of a species that Kant himself well knew to be full of beings, every one of which, quote, believed his own watch right, accept that everyone else should have the same endowment of rights, and that one might then oneself be subjected by others to the very domineering act one was considering imposing on them? Ethics cannot be fumigated of the vices of worldly corruptivist babble, and thereby be morally capitalized as a sovereign and unconditional authority over all wills, just insofar as they are capable of understanding themselves as rational, unless ethics can not just possibly, but even necessarily make sense as a categorical imperative, a binding claim from which no sane will can exempt itself. John Silber drew classical issues into a laconic change of inferences. Confronting the problem of evil, Kant was concerned not with natural disasters and faulty natural faculties, but with the power of free beings to misuse their freedom. He sought a rational account of moral obligation while admitting as brute fact that men can disregard it. How is categorical obligation possible? Since a categorical relation is a necessary one, and since obligation presupposes freedom, Kant had to show how necessity can be combined with freedom in a single relationship, from the introduction to Kant's Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Hegel would also later wrestle with this incompossibility of necessity and freedom in paradoxical Geist, the indisputable coincidentia oppositorum of all essential incongruities. Could a moral agent extend such a precept of entitlement across the entire species of moral agents? Could one even posit it to be an actual law of nature per se? Radical nihilism would eventually opt for the manias of ego over against the entire possibility of ethics and principles of any sort. Realpolitik, the position of Nazism, Stalinism, reactionism, Trumpism. But in his time, Kant's principles and method would wage its own erudite but existential reign of terror against idiosyncratic ad hoc privileges for the sake of a pellucid crystalline structure of rights, which, being rational, unlike privileges, have to be reciprocal and primordial, with validated rational and autonomous motives and interests. Every moral proposal involves one in a direct transaction with the very principle of reason as such. A summary form of grave seriousness, Kant analogizes to the dignity and sobriety of the act of high authority of a legislator. Egocentrists, of course, desire the practical or rhetorical advantages to themselves of obliging others to be ethical, while denying any authority to such principles over their own selves. To hypocrites, ethics is merely a way of inflicting handicaps on their opponents, while privately reserving an attitude of nihil admirari, nothing is to be respected, to themselves. To concentrate Kantianism into brief theses is unthinkable, but key to much of his conceptualization is a Gestalt insight or analogy concerning conscious rational ego, where Descartes, as a founder of modern naive rationalism, had posited a notion of res cogitans, or something that thinks, a wretchedly sketchy, rigorless non-definition. Kant understood the rational essence within each thinking subject as a principle of unity or of a unitary field. Ego, to Kant, was fundamentally, if tacitly, analogous to a concept. Just as a concept is the overarching principle of unity over the particulars it embraces, so is ego over the topics and concepts that are its rational repertory. To function as a rational being, ego requires an inventory or apparatus of concepts, of categories that serve as its vocabulary of intelligibility and critique, i.e., its subjective organs for apprehending whatever it may attempt or manage to comprehend categorially. Just as Descartes availed himself of a pre-existing working vocabulary for philosophizing from his Jesuit teachers, so Kant helped himself to the table of categories set out by a predecessor, the popularizer of rationalism, Christian Wolff. But given Kant's rational format and claims, his categories should have been capable of demonstrating their to-the-core rationality as an interwoven organon by being deducible one from another via a rational method of proof, and so ultimately derivable from the rational authority of Kantian ego. Kant never doubted this could and should be done, but in fact, he himself never did it. And when this task was actually carried out, it was by the genius of Hegel in the science of logic, who reared a different concept of subjectivity and of logic as well, the dialectic. It was through Kant's labors in ethics that his accomplishments seized command over an empire of not just philosophical, but also political, social, legal, dramatic, homiletic, and other intellects. To come to terms with Kant's core ethical agenda and his daunting new methods of criticizing away the hoary stupors and irrationalisms of bygone ways, any and every serious intellectual or creative had to learn to live and breathe in the frosty ether atop Mount Mount Immanuel Kant, top of the page. This most seriously abstract of self-attitudes had in a flash become vital to living and communicating in European modernity. These new perspectives swept like wildfire through all culture bearers within the new order of the ages, Novus Ordo Secularum. Biographers describing the lives and careers of writers, artists, or thinkers, contemporary or epigonic to Kant, invoked a common phrase, the Kant crisis, or for the epidemic effect of this provincial citizen of modest little Königsberg, the thinker whose rigorized insights became a categorical imperative for all souls being inducted into modern culture. The austere and chilling, if not depressing and paralyzing effect of Kant's sovereign concept of rationality made of Kantianism a cutting-edge paradigm of the one, the true, and the good, save, as we shall see, the topic of the good having to be jettisoned in order to cure the theory of ethics of any relativism, subjectivism, or other liability to deviation. Kant may not, I argue, did not, have a solution or cure for the most deep-set irrationalisms and obsessive demonisms of his, much less our own epoch. But ultimately, no one can achieve clarity and sound footing in ethics without submitting his casuistic arguments to the Supreme Court of Kantian universalism. The erudite German poet Heinrich Heine's work had been long revered throughout the most literate nations of Europe. He naturally stood as their interpreter of the ferment of Germany's visionary philosophers. The word visions should be struck from the end of the sentence. Pungently, Heine recognized of the formidable iconoclasm latent within Kant's master strokes of axiomatics and critiques. What a strange contrast between the outer life of the man and his destructive, world-annihilating thoughts. This is from Heine's Religion and Philosophy in Germany. If Immanuel Kant, the arch-destroyer in the realm of ideas, far surpassed Robespierre in terrorism, still he had many similarities with the latter. In the first place, we find in both the same stubborn, keen, prosaic, sober integrity. We likewise find in both the same talent of suspicion, only that the one directed it toward thought and called it criticism, while the other applied it to people and entitled it republican virtue. But both represented in the highest degree the type of the narrow-minded bourgeois. Nature had destined them for weighing out coffee and sugar, i.e. as shopkeepers. But fate decided they should weigh out other things and placed on the scales of the one a king and on the scales of the other a god, and they both gave the correct weight. Regardless of what Kant meant to do or thought he had done, he fed an immense asocial insularity or monadism of principle in modern will, a repudiation of any possibility of supra-egological or of infra-egological, i.e. natural or even social authority. Indeed, of any determining principle other than one's own scrupulously isolated, self-governing, but myopic will.
Think we have a disconnect. I am imagining he will call back. So just hang tight. Yeah, telephone disconnect, that looks like. All right, please stand by.
Was the perfect intro to self-isolating will, myopic will.
Yeah, it's it's clear that in the revision that he did in preparation for the seminar, he decided he wanted to spend some more time talking about Kant's own perspective and expanded this section before he turned the other philosophers loose on Kant. So that's fair. That's reasonable. It gives Kant more of a chance to be present before he gets dissected, I guess.
I may edit out the break if I need to for the official recording.
Sure. Yeah, I really like his writing. he does not mess around. He goes right for the throat. He's definitely a polemicist, but he does the thing as a polemicist where he doesn't try to take them down by distorting their argument, but by saying it as clearly as possible so that its implications can be seen and the repercussions. Clearly, I'm going to have to update the text that I have in my draft of his Old World Principles book we're putting together, because this is a... He told me yesterday he'd made a few little edits to add a few terse words to it, but this is a significant overhaul.
Yeah, if anybody noticed, I did post it up this morning, and this updated version. I don't know if anybody could have gotten to it in time, but...
David, do you want to maybe like when he reconnects and like continue reading, like to share your screen of the paper? Well,
that might be an idea.
Yeah. If you want to share your screen, I'll give him a call just to make sure.
Yeah, it's on the description of the meetup page. Anybody can take the opportunity now to download it and get it ready. I mean, the update.
Yeah, no, the update is up there, yeah, because I haven't noticed any disparities. So.
Download it and whatever device, put it on the device you're on at the moment, and you'll be able to read along.
You could have someone continue reading in case he is hung up for a while. We can proceed. He's read it. He knows the text.
I think Rick's calling to see if we can connect with him again.
Does anyone here know of any good PDF annotation software that allows you to make really good notes alongside the PDF with highlights instead of just those little squares?
have you tried using a Foxit Reader as a free option?
How do you spell it?
I'll type. Let's see. Whoops.
F-O-X or
IT, yeah. FXIT, yeah. Foxit.
Okay.
I assume if I use a special add-on like that, that eventually they're going to go out of business and I'll have an unreadable document. So I just stick with Adobe.
Yeah.
Foxit Reader's been around for a while. I've been using it probably close to a decade. Just as a free reader, it's definitely way superior than Adobe Reader as a reader. Yeah, I've heard friends, in content creation kind of gripe, like maybe say switching from full-on Acrobat to Foxit, because they're used to a certain flow. But as a reader, yeah, I'd highly recommend checking it out. There's no downside to that.
Might not corrupt your document at all. Yeah.
Has anyone tried using Bookends, the bibliography software, as a PDF markup machine?
Dave, remember last week in Kant when I said, can't we see the three faculties, the sort of ego, superego, and id? And here it is. I'm reading ego here as understanding.
Doesn't do it for me, though. Maybe it's a Freudian tuning thing.
I'm not sure what taking so. I think reading it might be a good idea because this is going to take away time from discussion, which is.
Well,
what
we'll
we
see.
usually do.
Rick's, I think, has a hold of him. Does anybody remember exactly where we left off? Page 7,
Top of page 7, yeah.
very top.
No, I think it's about 3 lines in. I just actually scrolled up. Myopic will, I believe.
Yeah.
So what were Kant's questions?
What, Steve? Could you?
What were Kant's questions? Did he ever ask a question?
Come on, cat. Stop it.
Well, you know, the infamous nature of Douglas Adams stumbled across something that must be well within philosophy, and that is we live in a world which is preoccupied with answers. Whereas Douglas Adams was pointing out, well, how well did we understand the questions? What are the questions? We assume the answers are easy. and we have a poor understanding of the questions. Like the question, who are you? Or the moment in Planet of the Apes where Charlton Heston says, "Get your hands off me, you stinking ape."
Well, I wouldn't venture to say anything because I am not a Kant scholar. I'm not an expert of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
But it
No,
seems to me,
I've asked a question. I haven't demanded an answer. I just said there's a question. What was Kant's question?
I think Hume asked a question and Kant is trying to answer it. I think that's what it was.
So Kant himself had no questions.
Well, he was questioning whether Hume was correct.
Oh, okay, beautiful. See, I've got a real problem, I'm suffering from behaviorism, and that is I'm convinced I'm simply a monkey, and everything I do, the ambition at the end of the day is to get some bananas. The only reason I engage in, say, the love of great artworks is to get more bananas. The only reason I'm nice to humanity in general is I hope this way I'll secure my future supply of bananas. So I see a vain lowness in all achievements of the human spirit.
Lucas put an interesting comment, which I think is a direct quote, actually. So Kant asks at least 3, but maybe these 4 questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope for? And what is man? So those seem like pretty extensive set of questions to work on. So the middle one, the what ought I do, is the issue of this paper, which is the critique of practical reason and examination of the metaphysics of morals. So Kant was looking to question whether we have a basis for asserting an ought. And what does that mean in, for everyone?
I'm owed bananas.
Yeah.
Hand over all your bananas.
Right. So what does that have to do with ought? Right.
Oh, that's the ought. Ought means to owe. I have to convince all the other monkeys that they owe me bananas as the supreme receiver of bananas.
Right. And so in examining that, he asks, is there anything to that sort of reasoning, that sort of acting and behaving that creates a system that you can respect and find dignity in as a human being? And, that's sort of where
there is only one dignity, that is the dignity of more bananas.
Right. If that seems like dignity, then you can certainly hold that position, but that doesn't really strike a chord with most people that hear it as having found actually what the word dignity refers to. Seems to have to do more with your choices.
Actually, most animals, we do too. We like banana. We look for bananas, but humans are plagued also with never being satisfied with the bananas that they have. They want something more than that or better than that. And that explains all the rest of the stuff.
Haven't they done experiments with chimpanzees that if you give chimpanzee a reward for doing something, and then you don't give it, or at least you give them a smaller reward for doing the same thing, that the second monkey will get very upset, chimpanzee, because they seem to understand the concept of fairness, right? So it's not like, well, I'm happy I got this small grape and he got a banana or whatever. It's just like, no, he got that, I did the same thing. So I'm not sure if some other animals don't have a concept of fairness and, in a sense, dignity behind that.
I would just call it envy.
The question is any of that something that you could point to and say, yep, that really nails it for me. I really respect that. Or that once you call it good, that you can go back and re-examine that decision and say, I still call it good. In other words, from every angle I look at it, in terms of exactly, is there anything you can really call good and stick with that? And, you know, his first claim is he finds one thing you can call good, and then he breaks off from there to do all his work. So if you find something good, that would be a starting point. Sorry.
By good, do you mean good in the sense that Locke uses the term good as in utility? And in what sense do you mean good?
Right, that's the open question. Can you find something of any category, of any sort, that remains universally, eternally, unconditionally good? And almost everything you point at, for example, exercising, yeah, that could be good, but you can hurt yourself. But, you know, a decision to save money, maybe you should be spending it. There's no rule you can make that I can't point out the bad side. Get educated. No, go work. Yeah, I mean, you can balance all kinds of values against anything, but so it's not a trivial question. The hammer's good for hammering, but not for screwing a screw.
So you mean good morality, not utility or use?
I think the question is open because but it turns out that if you go for utility, then it's just, yeah, it works sometimes and doesn't work other times. So he addresses that problematically.
We can imagine that there's such a thing as it's possible to imagine that there's such a thing as a generic good. So we begin with that. Like David is saying, every particular good fails in some way. Nonetheless, we can isolate the concept good, and then we can wonder, is there something to it? And Kant's answer is, yes, there is something that's good, and that's the good. I guess it's the only really good answer.
Don't even with that, don't you have to inscribe it within what is being human or what's being a man? If that's one of the four basic questions you say he's asking, then it seems to me what's good for being a human or being a man is different than what's good for being an ox, as an example. I mean, like, so even that has got its limitations. So in order to understand,
that's right.
In order to understand his morality, then therefore you have to kind of take the stepping stone about what is being human or being a man.
That's right. Yeah, I shouldn't have said that. It is already more specific. It's about treating others. That's right. It's not just about any type of, it's the goodness of treatment.
Well,
is there a general generic rule for goodness of treatment? Could you state it's possible to state in language?
Right. So he turns it into a propositional, formal, logical issue and tries to define it that way. But the kernel of good has to agree with your kernel of good. And he says the thing that you can never deny that's good is what he calls the goodwill. And he tries to highlight what that could possibly mean. He means very specifically, this is my guess of how to interpret a decision made in a context with a full awareness of whatever is in that context, right? A decision that when it's made, you cannot disagree. That was, in other words, it was a choice to do something in some way that you'll say, that's good. And then he believes that there is such a thing as like a decision made in a way that you will call good. And if
So
he can
just so
pinpoint that, and you'll never be able to go back and say, no, that was bad. It was good. You made a decision. Like you swerved your car to avoid running over the child. Even though you're in a hurry, you slammed on the brakes, whatever. That was a good. If we could agree that was good. No context. Oh, but it was Hitler. You saved. None of that bullshit affects the fact that your decision in its context was an act of good. And he wants to know what is the good? And it turns out he can characterize it as not being filled with contradiction about human life, not being about being universalizable to a rule anyone should apply at any time. In fact, the law of nature should work that way. That's his categorical imperative.
And putting other people first. I mean, there's multiple formulations. One is treating others as ends, the end principle that always steps in when there's these Nazis in the attic problems. So in the end, it's really just what the Dalai Lama says. You're being maximally kind, and you're trying to put others first and treating them well. That's it. If you wish them well, that's so it allows for problems because you can wish someone well, and it turns out that it is baby Hitler. But that's not the question. The question is how do you come up with the description of the good? And the answer is the person was trying to save the baby, not run it over. It's trying to do well.
But there's a hierarchical privilege there. In other words, it seems like in his argument, the ultimate good is reason, right? In other words, reason determines what's good, and its sort of lieutenant is duty. Reason tells his lieutenant to instruct us to follow the duty of reason. So therefore, in some sense,
that's the anemic formal version that we're making fun of in this paper. But there's also the goodwill thing, which is a little more substantive.
No, I understand, but I'm just sort of saying his limitation is he's already privileging something that I'm not sure whether even in his way of seeing things, whether reason is the highest principle that should circumscribe morality. I mean, he seemed to, because you can't make any decision outside of his way of arguing that it has to be reason, and then duty follows after reason, and then you do whatever duty calls you, rather than the heart or whatever that comes
if
by.
I could just follow, as hollowing out the term good and use it as a with a set, right? You have a meanings go with it. And one is an ends to a means for morality, which sounds like it would be used in morality. But in a different instance, we're substituting it for reason, which seems like we're implying necessity, right? Which is usually the root for coming up with axioms. So am I understanding you all correctly? You're saying hollow out the word good and then kind of fill in the blank for whatever the ends means, whether it's morality or utility or duty or reason. Am I understanding that correctly?
These are all bourgeois ethical theories. Once capitalism swept through Europe, swept through Flanders, all the way to the shore, taking people's land and destroying the commons, it also disconnected them from their traditions. So you could no longer just listen to the alpha to find out what was right and true. So there was this dream that that may be a pure contradiction itself, something that everyone must agree about. Everyone must agree that A is not A. What if you could use something like that as a source for deriving substantive principles? And so Kant thought that do unto others was like was a purely formal rule. So it wasn't something that was inherited in traditional and religious. It applied to everyone, and it fit this idea that there was something like a universal science of ethics. It's not just doing what your parents say. I mean, we know this is the Enlightenment. You don't just copy your parents anymore. You think for yourself. But once you start thinking for yourself, is there anything besides the local tribal rules that can serve as a basis for morality? Maybe logic itself can. And that's the dream of rationalism, is to try to derive as much as you can by presupposing as little as possible. And being presuppositionless is kind of a mode of science. So you're bringing this mode of not presupposing, you're not bringing the Bible to the laboratory. You're blanking your mind and letting whatever happens in the laboratory be the facts. So it's a clearing away of superstition and tradition and custom, and trying to see what you can get for nothing by assuming as little as possible.
So you're saying there are absolutes. So if A is always A, there are no if and only if values. So A is only A if and only if. So there are no conditional values. You're stating it as there are absolutes in the universe.
He's saying there's a way to examine your moral question and parse it. And if you have a choice to do or not do, the difference between those things, you can tell if doing A entails you in a contradiction about life and being a rational living entity, which let's just say human. If it entails you are committing a violation of just being consistent about what it means to be a human acting, the law of contradiction is essentially the categorical imperative. Don't contradict what it means to be a rational being acting in a world.
Well, then Phil pointed out there are degrees, right? That's why we have degrees of truth, which is why I pointed out if and only if. So if we're saying there are not degrees, and we are saying that there aren't degrees of truth as it's defined with philosophy, we're stating that there are absolutes in the universe.
It's a formal, but not, it doesn't constitute the values for you, but it gives you a form to test whether your decision can be considered immoral.
But we know there are false negatives in the universe. We know that there are false negatives.
I should be aware.
Which is why there are degrees and degrees of truth.
Kenneth Smith is back.
We're back.
Welcome back.
Oi. All right, so I should get my phone and crank it up and drop what? No, what?
Can we see his beautiful face?
Well, we're hearing you just fine. So
he's flying blind.
Page 7. Are we page 7's where we left off? Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me though.
Right, so I should hang up with you?
Yes.
All right, great. Bye.
All right. Continuing.
Yeah, now I just have to find my place.
Self-governing but myopic will at the top of page 7.
Yeah. Okay.
Victory! We persevered over the technology.
Yeah. If something goes wrong this time, it'll be my computer blowing a fuse.
I think he did it on purpose so that we could have a discussion.
Well, you're philosophers, you'll benefit no matter what happens. It's all grist for our mill. Okay. As if Descartes' signature privativism or escapism had become a universalized qualification for human reason, or for any form of humanity at all, a willed fate. When Nietzsche pronounced The Death of God, The Gay Science, number 125, as nothing less than man's own self-resolutions and self-preconceptions, the narrownesses of microtoming ego to which, quote, Homo sapiens, unquote, had doomed itself by making itself unfit to grasp what any such being as God or any such spiritual authority as a societal civilizational ethos could even possibly mean to contracted and encastled modern mortals. Nietzsche is merely drawing the ultimate inference from, quote, pious, unquote, Kant's radical premise of ethical rational autonomism, of all modern humanity's doom to be decisively the victim of its own myopic, quote, self-discipline. It is to these Kantian constrictions that historical sociologists must trace the withering away of nomoi the subtle kinds of laws in their many diverse forms and modes to which human beings are subject, and koinonia, Greek word for community, of course, communal values, and of course the value of communality, the infra and supra-egological desertification that Nietzsche had marked as modern amentheia, mythlessness, or stone deafness to any strata resonant with wisdom. It is, from Kant on, a moral sin to seek the dictates of conscience anywhere other than in the evacuated precisionist premises of purified, i.e., self-imprisoned or idiotized ego, itself truly, in all regards, a scrupulously paranoid germaphobe, but above all else, violently repellent of the condition of life that makes all organisms riddled with microbes and viruses as a precondition of their own inner metabolism. All of modern culture, in its own way, enforces the scientific polarization of the standpoint in vitro versus in vacuo, in vitro in vacuo, from the standpoint in vivo. Politics, law, religion, academia, etc., are not just institutionally, but also characterologically hostile to right-brained or gnosic existentiality, the art of thinking in concreto and syncretistically as Einstein or Fellini or Valery did. As with modern science, so too with Kant's ethics. Its power or cogency derives from an intensification or concentration, a rigorous code of ceteris paribus, or other things being equal, i.e., equally negligible. A wholesale exclusion of subjects and questions that had previously complicated the matter and form of ethics, diverting it from Kant's linear drive toward rational stringency or a priorist necessitude. For rationalism is hell-bent on reconceiving ethics in the modus of Euclidean geometry. For Kant, ethics can have nothing to do, therefore, with axiology, or the comprehension of what is good or what good is obligated or permitted to mean in strictly ethical matters. As one severely Kantian thinker expressed it to me, value has become just, quote, an existential term for a surd, i.e., a rationally undefinable or inexpressible something that cannot be admitted as a rigorizable topic for Kantian ethics. As to values, countervailing positions may be taken within rationalist ethics toward any value without it or its exclusionary anti-value being indisputably refuted, and antagonistic values may be rationally defended over against one another by different thinkers without any formal contradiction between the two positions. Kant's stringent rationalism is, on the one hand, a form above and beyond political, moral, religious, and other conflicts, and on the other hand, an ethereal deontology or theory of duty and obligation that is of no critical value or perhaps even no relevance concerning disagreements over what is vicious or virtuous, morally benign or malignant. Kant may have contributed more to the evacuation of all residues of wisdom from philosophy than any modern thinkers save Descartes and the Anglo-Saxon analysts. This is not to say that, in spite of the programmatic tenor of modernity, seedlings of wisdom do not nonetheless crop up volunteer, as gardeners say, but seedlings do not a civilizational symposium, much less a culture, make. To qualify as formally rational, an ethical will must consider its agenda as universally legislated or extended as a right to any and all other ethical wills. That will's proposed action or position must be acceptable to its proponent as something enforced without exception as a virtual, quote, law of nature. If someone expects assistance, charity, or medical care from others, that person must concede these as rights to others. If one, however, is willing to forego them as duties because they do not impinge rationally on one's will, then one is also released from them as claims from one's fellow wills. a hardcore capitalist could rationally will the starvation and extinction of most proletarians, or a colonial emperor of most aborigines, just as long as that genocidal autocrat recognized and accepted that he too, in a position of deprivation of wealth and power, might righteously also be exterminated. Both the bleeding heart charity of a liberal and the stony-hearted miserliness of a social Darwinian or materialistic Scrooge could appeal to the rationalizing rigors of Kant's categorical imperative, which without values or wisdom amounts to little more than positional monomania. You absolutize your own axiom. Kant takes no other collateral principle in ethics but duty that is vital as a transcendental precondition of the possibility of ethics. But we have had a specimen of duty-saturated social and political codes that produced world history's most depraved experiments in nihilist inhumanity and irrationality. The Nazi racist ethos, quote unquote ethos, that yielded the wanton policies of Adolf Eichmann showed us how utterly slavish, quote, obedience to duty becomes in a personality exsanguinated of every vestige of morality, save the absolute necessity of, quote, just obeying orders. Even under totalitarianism's ironclad delusions, a handful will recollect the power and vitality of conscience. But the evil ingenuity of modern Machiavellian Pavlovian experimenters can readily cyber-deracinate lingering anachronisms of foreclosed upon individualism. Humans in their very human, all too human liabilities can be catechized to take radically for granted a more passive or a more macho culture matrix, a more mammalian or a more reptilian culture. We have learned fearsome things from our immediate centuries of Banausic or utilitarian exploitationist dominance of mass souls, quote, soulcraft. Only through the law-like discipline of authentically ethical code can any human claim to be a principle of, quote, sovereignty, sovereignty or autonomy over himself or herself, transcendent over biopsychological needs and interests, no less than over libidinal social conventional norms and expectations. Kant's rational integrity or coherence of criteria between self and others is sternly directed against the appetitivism and materialism that so infest utilitarian thinking, Bentham, Mill, Hume, and of course the environing order of capitalist plutocracy and its crypto-slavery and unconstrained parasitism. Not the self or ego in just any of its relations, but only in strictly rational ways of construing itself count as ethical, and as such, as just as valid for any rational will as for any other. The earmark of modern diz culture, the nihilist contempt for all that is vital to life and health, no less than for self-constraint, truth, etc., is its internal plague of factors treasonous against the very possibility of ethical will. Nihilism has entrained its power-besotted acolytes within an opium cloud of uncriticizability. Long paragraph quoted. The aide, a senior advisor to G.W. Bush, apparently Karl Rove, said that guys like me, Bron Suskind, in what, quote, in what we call the reality-based community, an expression of contempt, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. Quote, that's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. Quote, we're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. From Ron Suskind, Faith, Certainty, and the Presidency of George W. Bush from the New York Times Magazine. Omnipotence, even as a dream, emancipates its addicts from reality, unleashes them into narcotic incommunicado. Power, like wealth, draws to itself magnetically the hireling facilitators who perfect its impunity and its mass mind fog. In our postmodern Platonic cave of mass shadow special effects and mass puppet manipulations, even the all-powerful are gulled into a narcosis by the masters of the black arts of mindfuck. Even those who have arrogated all mega power and mega wealth are silly putty in the hands of their own viziers. More than ever, crypto-totalitarian institutions and corporate media shape a social matrix as detached from mortal individual historical existence as any free-floating Hindenburg dirigible. The ominous cautions of William Burroughs from 1962 have met only ears of stone and glazed over eyes. To concern yourself with surface political conflicts is to make the mistake of the bull in the ring. You are charging the cloth. That is what politics is for, to teach you the cloth. From the Journal for the Protection of All Beings. Hegel's mordant inference on the philosophy of history grows more dark and labyrinthine every year. Quote, all that we learn from history is that no one has ever yet learned anything from history or tried applying its lessons. In part two, I turn for the rest of my argument to more overtly revolutionary excavations of the complex and variously inclined forms veined within our existence. Hegel first, then Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. Thank you.
There we have it.
Such as it is.
A lot to take in.
I like the ending. It sounds like while the ruling class has good material substantive norms, namely owning their class position in the future and stupefying the workers, the working class is piddling around with this formalist ethics and not getting together and realizing this other thing that you're alluding to.
Well, nihilism would imply that it's seriously doubtful that you could even put a class together. How can the members of a class trust one another?
Well, Rainbow Coalition, they'll have to be local, like you're suggesting. You're anti-universalist, anti-formalist. So the struggles will be
the scale at which people are organized does not affect the fact that none of these people have any commitment to principle, any comprehension of what principles would mean. There are no unconditionally valid norms. Everything is usable, of course, for as long as it is usable. The individuals who are making their own idiosyncratic calculations of what serves their purposes, their self-interest.
I heard you using interesting terms. You're using useful, you're using utilitarian, you use the word mind fuck. So when you are using the term good, you are using it in the sense that Locke used, right? As a utility, as a use.
No, I'm not.
You're not. Okay. Could you explain what you mean by mind fuck?
Utility as such would really have no normative authority. Kant would call it a mechanical or a conditional norm. That is, it's an imperative only insofar as you happen to subscribe to the purpose for which that utilitarian value is useful.
Well, you use the example of Karl Rove, and he's explaining that we are only taught to see the cloth, right? And earlier you talked about the ego. So when you say as such, go ahead.
Excuse me, those are two different quotes. I mean, the quote from William Burroughs is the quote about the bull ring. Mm-hmm. That would be what the consequences are of the kind of nihilistic arrogance that Rove is participating, Rove and Bush, whom he subserves.
Right.
I mean,
But you mentioned we own the cloth. We don't see the forces behind it, right? What's really behind the cloth. But we're trained to see the cloth. That was a quote, right?
well, what's behind the cloth is, of course, the sword, the steel.
But we're trained to see the cloth. That was your quote, correct?
Yes, they're not my quote, but the quote from Burroughs. What people are trained to react to what's phenomenal, what is apparent, what the media can glut their senses with. As in Plato's time, still it is the case that the vast majority of human beings, no matter what their ideologies, they are by nature keyed into the world of the visible, the palpable. There's several senses that are cheated in the process of the mass media's propagation, but nonetheless, slavery has a very high coincidence with the factor of phenomenalism. This is the Greeks' original, and essentially the outlook of the Greeks would say people who have been blighted with respect to rationality, will, culture, values, conscience, they have been given phenomena.
Gotcha. So at the slavery level, then, as such, utility would be good in your opinion.
This is this is a modal, fatal consideration. It's not something that, what can I say? It is a matter of cosmic understanding. You have to be capable of thinking about the whole of things. You have to think.
You said as such. I heard it. I heard you.
Okay. Yes. Good. Well, my point is, someone can be extremely adept at manipulating particulars. Someone can be keyed into the evidency of the phenomenal world. These things don't help. They may, in fact, just be ways of attuning people to misleading or irrelevant aspects of existence. And these aspects would be entire realms of existence. People do not have a problem feeding their tendency toward escapism, because the whole modus of mass media, of facile, i.e. journalism, education, conversation, etc., the kinds of problems that arouse philosophical concerns and philosophical issues, these demand a kind of world orientation that the Greeks called aristic. I mean, from the standpoint of the Greeks, since they were more or less the inventors of philosophia and democratia, from their standpoint, there are two of the three types of human personality or mentality that have no place in democratic culture. People who are merely passive, merely consumers, people who are eminently conditionable, this passive mode of the individuals who have no impulse to escape the slavish tenor of their existence. Those people should not be making policy for the whole polity. And people who are money obsessed, people who are mercenary, people for whom nothing in society matters except for the cash value of anything, profiteering, etc. The douloi, that lower class of servants, which the Greeks don't believe should be abused, but they are a divine encumbrance. That is to say, because human beings want to form a society, and because human beings, as nature delivers them to us, are not equitably competent for living in that kind of society, these people would be exposed to exploitation by the unscrupulous, etc., etc. I mean, from the Greek point of view, slavery is supposed to be what's the word I want, a parentalism.
Okay, so you're saying slavery as such, in terms of utilitarianism, is favorable, is what you're saying?
Is favorable?
Is good, as Locke presented it. Is that what that sounds like? What you're saying?
Slavery, you know, the world would be different, of course, if human beings could produce human beings all to a uniform standard of competence. But we don't make human beings. We try to deal with them as they present themselves. And because they are not equitably able to rise to the challenge of political argumentation, people who lack that philosophical aristeia, the excellence of thinking in a philosophical way. I mean, you have to bear in mind, the Athenians understood that they had what was almost certainly a privileged position historically, in that they had roughly equal portions in the classical era, roughly equal portions. They were about 1/3 douloi, about 1/3 banausoi, the mercantile class, and 1/3 aristic. Now, eventually, as we see that what is going on in the age of Socrates is the waning of the aristic culture, the aristic population. It is far easier for people to pass themselves off as being rational, competent, pious, etc. I mean, all the Socratic dialogues, more or less, show Socrates attacking the wholesale hypocrisy of people who have never been radically challenged in their righteous ability.
Thank you for your time. I do have one last question, then I'll step back and I'll just ask a question.
Sure.
Who has the authority? Who is endowed with the authority to make the decision in terms of who is rationally competent to make those decisions? Who is this authority?
Well, this is a question that is obviously going to impact us in a far different way than it does Plato. Plato believed, of course, the populace of the population of the Republic should be kept to 5,000 or less. And the reason for that, of course, is everyone needs to know as well as possible, the real character, the interactive tendencies of other human beings who are members of the polis. It should be, under those circumstances, a fair, accessible to common sense, the common sense of most people. There may be disagreements. Those will have to be worked out. We have an entirely different situation. We don't have a culture that enables us to come together in a common matrix of cultural norms, values, etc. We believe in cultivating what the Greeks would call idiotia, eccentricity. Consequently, we have a population, as we are fearsomely discovering more and more as our problems snowball, we have a population that would perhaps something close to a majority of people are in fact retarded. They're not, they have never been challenged to perform at an adult level. Our newspapers have, I mean, I can remember back when, what, 40, 50 years ago, newspapers took the standard of a 10-year-old. You know, a story should be intelligible to a 10-year-old. They've got, you know, the content of newspapers and sophistication of the stories and the writing, you know, has gradually shifted up, and the population's intelligence has shifted down. So of course the newspapers are losing their readership. But the problems that confront us are vastly more sophisticated, more complex than they were a generation ago. So the question you ask, who should make this decision? Well, I'm not so sure we have very many people at all who are fit to make them. Academics don't like to make judgments of character about their students' values, because this obliges the academics to justify their own positions on values. And that's going to be shaky, if anything. We have a fundamentally amoral educational system. Character is not a consideration. And why would we be surprised when our faculties turn out to be pretty much characterological? So, I mean, when I was still teaching, I had a problem tossed into my lap. I was the only member of the philosophy department who had any serious grounding in ethics and also any serious grounding in sociology as well as philosophy. The department was getting requests from academics, from professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc., who wanted courses taught in professional ethics. So I had this issue tossed into my lap. And professional ethics basically drew, at that time, on the one hand, from Aristotle, a code of aristic competence. To be gifted, to be extraordinary in one's competence, imposes obligations. And from this, the professions have a kind of duty that isn't borne out in any, they make a judgment concerning what is good and right for their patients, their clients, etc. They act in their clients' best interests. Now, auto mechanics don't do this. Grocers don't do this, etc. On the other hand, we have Kant. That's the other main tributary feeding modern ethics. And at the time, there very, very little understanding of Aristotle. So one could understand how professional ethics was waning because it had nothing but a gravely egalitarian ethics to rely on, but the kinds of responsibilities that professionals are taxed with, those responsibilities are extraordinary. They impinge on them because, because they are abled in a radically different degree from the general public. So, I mean, all these issues have grown sharper and sharper over the decades. The conflicts have grown more combative. There is not much of a common ground to discuss these things. Yeah, please.
Could I ask
Can
a question?
I
Let me ask a
don't think-
question.
yeah.
Well, I
don't-
think we gotta have some order here. I think let's go with David and then Stephen and then you, Phil, if we can. Is that all right with everyone? Okay, David. Yes. Thank you for your patience. Go right ahead.
Right, there's a way to raise hands so that people can get in line and it just keeps track of who raises their hands. We can all talk. Yeah, so I mean, I'm trying to grab your thesis and get the gist of it, and and I started to. I like the critique of. I mean, I like the whole interpretation of Kant. Where it went, and then I began to lose the thread a little bit around when the critique really began, like sort of bringing up the idea that it's a sin to look at ancient wisdom, look at the Greeks, Aristotle, the Bible, because Kant talks about training and access to wisdom is not something I think, in fact, his examples of what moral action would look like generally involves, very simple communal exchanges or some kind of responsibility to somebody, even something, stories that are all told as parables practically, just in some bare simplicity. So they carry, a principle in them. And so I don't actually see that there's any problem in referring to old wisdom because he's a scientist. So he does not object to reading, Euclid or probably even the Greeks, although, Newton has the update on how we do science now. So he'd want you to, understand the reasoning that brought you there. So I don't see that conflict as in Kant. And the idea that people have different capabilities and that we are not ultimately completely rational, any of us. I mean, he confronts that directly and saying, I think almost in the first person, I don't know if I have ever been made a totally rational decision, but that's my duty. So it frames what the objective, the ideal, the striving, what an ought would come from is that possibility that you can abide by law. So, the fact that a 10-year-old or a not so gifted person, is limited isn't really an argument against rational morality because that doesn't mean they have to be cruel and disregard other people if they are minimally intelligent enough to understand that there are other people who have feelings. I mean, they're already at a level that they can coexist in a morally functioning way. So the fact that, some people aren't as capable and there are misconceptions that people hold doesn't, just the same way that doesn't unjustify science, the fact that we don't understand gluons or I don't, doesn't mean that there aren't people who can, but it's not part of what I have to deal with every day anyway. That doesn't unjustify science, nor would it unjustify this kind of morality, which says there's a discipline to thinking that allows you to find when you're going to do something not moral. So do you believe that structure for autonomous individual freedom is undermined?
Well, what is apparent to, I think, the Greeks and still apparent to us, if we look at matters in a non-dogmatic or non-prescriptive way, there is going to be a spectrum. It's not just a matter that everybody is. I mean, we're not going to equalize people in any significant way by saying nobody's perfect. That's just a dictate. That is a popular generalization. The problem is how much defect in rationality can we afford before we can't afford to allow someone to become an attorney or a doctor, a surgeon, even a pharmacist.
That's a moral question. They might make a mistake, so we don't let them have an occupation.
It's not a matter of making a mistake. It's a matter of the moral judgments that they make. Look, just mastering Kant is a formidable task in itself. There are people at whom one could talk and talk and talk and talk, and still the basic premises, the defining structures of Kant's argument can't be gotten across to them. Now, the differences, I mean, we have a certain amount of paternalism in our society. And sometimes we have a problem knowing where the line needs to be drawn. Do some people need to be sterilized? That was a biting issue. The United States was a pioneer in lobotomizing people.
We had slaves. We've learned a few things, somewhat.
That's immaterial. The point is, we have not been, if things are so obvious as they should purportedly be obvious, why have we wavered in the way that we have? Our treatment of racism was an inspiration to the Nazis. They came over and studied how we had decimated or exterminated most of our Aborigines. I mean, people's grasp of the largest scale, the most cosmic social realities is totally plastic. There are people.
If you took a vote in the Senate today, you would probably find that the world was created 3,000 years ago, not 13 billion years ago. But that does not change the fact that there is science.
No, but what happens when you have a population, the vast majority of whom can't even rise to the level of Bishop Ussher's calculation of when the world was created? There are people far more irrational than even the true believers in that doctrine. And the question is, can we draw the line? Is there a point at which someone really doesn't deserve to be a judge anymore? Someone doesn't deserve to be a principal or a president. Okay, we have a we have a deeply challenged hierarchy of values that is not as clear, not as articulated, not as it is not as much of a consensus as we suppose. And in the process of that loosening up of values and principles of ethics, etc., in the process of that, we have been oblivious to the rise and consolidation of class structure of a new personality form. I mean, we could call it nihilistic, we could call it a con man. It is, in fact, a con man culture. A great book on what has been happening to our politics and finance and Wall Street, etc., called Griftopia. This is a perfect country for con men to come and thrive in, because we're saps. That's the significance of people not being competent to carry on the responsibilities of their own affairs. That has become epidemic in the United States. And are we moving toward greater recognition of this unpopular, unpleasant actuality? Or are we just sinking into deeper denial about it?
I'm going to moderate a little bit here. So thank you, David, for your question. Next in line is Stephen. So Stephen, go ahead.
Okay, Kenneth, I've got a question with just more general philosophy here.
Yeah.
How important is an understanding of history to philosophy? I only take an amateurish interest, but it's been lifelong.
Yeah.
And I think there is a historical sort of consciousness. But the thing I tend to note today in a lot of these discussion groups is history is almost starting to be viewed as something irrelevant. Now, that wasn't something that was around 50 or 100 years ago. History was almost everything. to the major minds of previous times, but today it's been forgotten. Why is history important to the creation of a world conception? We have a big picture and we have a small picture. The grand totality requires history. What are your thoughts on that matter, Kenneth?
Well, there are the structures, cultural structures, norms, values, etc., that we live in. Some of these are sustained by us, and we are sustained by them in other respects. Now, these, the what should I call it? The concepts, the particular strategies for how to interpret these things arise in certain shapes, and these shapes undergo permutations, challenges, etc. People come along with, Kant had his followers, many of whom, the Marburg School, for example, that Ernst Cassirer represented, they believed Kant needed to be seriously corrected with knowledge of anthropology, knowledge of mythology, etc. Well, now, how the majority of humankind exists, what kind of culture, why they have adapted to living in a mythical matrix. What does this do for them? Why do they need it? Nietzsche, of course, thought there are issues that human beings just cannot rationally articulate. And they depend on intuitive or subliminal geniuses to be able to try and capture these deep sea ideas and principles and so forth. So that kind of thinking, which is, essentially philosophy gets salted with things it would not consider rational, but they are profound. They are axiomatic. We need something going on at every level of the scale. And these complex cultures come and go. People in the process of attempting to develop the traditions or schools of thought find that the things are changing their form in their hands, and alternatives, polemics are arising from other sources. There are parallelisms from one historical age to another. It was very interesting. There was a scholar and philosopher of Marxism, Kolakowski, who was quite knowledgeable about the history of Christianity. And it interested him that the kinds of doctrines and viewpoints that had arisen in the original formation of the church, and these ideas gradually gave way. They hardened into other forms and other perspectives. The same thing was happening in Marxism. How a doctrine gets institutionalized, and that's a historical matter. How a doctrine gets institutionalized tells us a lot about the logic of human nature, of social needs, historical forces, etc. We can't just live and think in terms of what is immediate here at hand and what we feel comfortable discussing, what we seem to understand, etc. We have to be able to enlighten ourselves with a certain sense of déjà vu. Other people have also dealt with these polemics, these controversies. And out of that comes hopefully a broader, wider, more sober, critical perspective. So, history is absolutely imperative. The greatest philosopher, arguably, also happens to be the master of the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history, Hegel. You know, yes, it's true. No one ever seems to learn anything from history. We keep repeating the same kinds of things. But for some people, rare as they may be, they can pick up on the logic of where these different trends are going and what may be the consequence. I mean, I mean, people have been greatly distressed, of course, of the rise of Trump's anarchism, etc. You know, we may be looking at the repetition of Weimar Germany, the kinds of issues that eventually made the Germans so desperate. You know, they needed compulsively to believe. They needed a Führer. And if we are lapsing into that kind of babble, we need to know that. We need to be able to ask that, you know, even though that is the most disturbing kind of question, to think that human beings might be fated to reiterate the same forms, the same patterns of decay and so on. So,
thank you, Stephen.
Yeah.
So next up in line is Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I have a question that came out through your talk. And I wonder whether, instead of seeing Kant as kind of the fall guy, I wonder whether we could look at it this way, that he is actually not issuing a prescriptive decision, philosophy of morality or ethics, but a descriptive one. What I mean by that is, it seems to me as civilization gets larger and more complex, and the density becomes so, that it becomes so unmanageable that it collapses under its own weight. And the only way you could actually evolve, in other words, the destiny of that collapse, is that it evolves into what appears to be a liberation, but it turns out to be a totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And my clue comes from the fact that within his thing about reason is the first lieutenant, reason is on top. He privileges reason. And that a lieutenant that governs the reason through morality or ethics is duty. But duty then, in a sense, falls into obligation. And what that does is that privileges, in a sense, a hierarchy in which the one who was smart, as you would put it, on top, could reach reason and conduct oracles, in which then, and the rest who could not understand or does not have the brains or does not have the time or whatever, then what they're governed by is not reason so much as duty and then obligation. This not only seems like a very militaristic form of ethics, but my thought is that I wonder whether what follows is not, in a sense, inevitability that, in a sense, with such density, the civilization evolves into a kind of a devaluation of individuation, because it's evolving into an organism itself. And I'm thinking of the metaphor of an ant colony. An ant is not seen as an individual. It is part of a system, a structure in which society, its hive, because what happened is that as civilization get more weighted down, you develop this hierarchy, and then it almost seems like the lower echelons of that becomes a herd mentality that develops into this organism. I wonder whether that is an inevitable destiny of civilization and therefore morality in order to get through this system. And And I'm just wondering whether, if you see it that way, it's almost as if, because you talked about history, whether he's not seeing history as a futurist that is descriptive of what is to come. So that seems interesting to me, because I see within this sort of like enlightenment, supposedly, is hidden this sort of like hierarchical structure, which is actually partially totalitarian, that could lead to this sort of thing.
Well, there have been a number of studies and arguments made that, I mean, we can look at Western culture as initially the rising arc of how the culture of individualism got put together, and contributions being made by Socrates and whoever, Descartes, Erasmus, et cetera, et cetera. And beyond a certain point, the precepts and the cultural bases on which that individuation took place in the growing phase, we passed that. And you could take any modernist thinker, philosopher that you wanted to look at. You could take Kafka, you could take Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. I mean, all of these people are looking at individuality as an embattled, it's not even a tradition any longer. There aren't enough people who subscribe to it or could comprehend to it, comprehend what its imperatives would mean for us. And, eventually, individuals, as that culture produced them to be individuals, are looked at from the standpoint of there being a kind of anti-culture. Everything that prevails, of course, in the 20th century, I mean, whether it's the robber barons that have grown a little more sophisticated and hired a lot of PR agents, whether it's essentially bureaucratization is the militarization of society. We can find a handful of anarchists who are philosophical anarchists. They're not just, they've got scrambled eggs for brains or whatever. They have, look at Bakunin or Herbert Reed or, any variety of Nietzsche is an anarchist of sorts. And it's been argued that even Marx is, because he idealized a form of society that was basically individuals leading a totally leisure life. You feel like fishing, you feel like writing a critique of a new book, you do whatever you like. Do one thing in the morning, another in the afternoon. And, his concept of what communist utopia is going to look like is radically different from what people suppose about Marx. But that concept is at war, and it is gravely disadvantaged by the established order of capitalism, capitalism has so taken command of our educational system, and absolutely higher education. The only thing that can be said as an established purpose for American academia is it's supposed to turn out qualified professionals to be subservient to the techno demands of capitalism and Wall Street and et cetera, et cetera. Every department other than finance, economics, the hard sciences, et cetera, every department that is redolent of traditional humanities is mortally handicapped. Their journals are unsupported. Back when I was teaching, the rate of acceptance in the humanities for contributions to journals was about 13 or 14%. And that, ironically, happened to be also the rate of rejection in the sciences, because there are that many more journals, and the journals have that much more support. And I hate to say it, but it seems to me that quality controls have just been blown all to hell and gone in the sciences. You know, it's a rare case where something that might be balderdash is going to get rejected. So, you know, all these things reflect decayed or eroded norms. Professors who are trying to single out voices of normative intelligence among the classical resources, contemporary resources, they are plotting a path for themselves that is highly unlikely to permit the accomplishment of a solid professional reputation. You know, it is individualism. You know, if you imagined that we wanted to evaluate university culture, publications, etc., if we wanted to evaluate these things in terms of the individuality of the approach, the tenor of the perspectives, if, you know, I tell my students, you had better get used to the idea. I have told my students, since I started long before I gave up on teaching, I told my students, you had better get used to the idea of searching out the most profound, most enlightening forms of thinking that have been done in the past couple of centuries. Because of the work that is done today, most of this is done for entirely extraneous purposes. People want to achieve tenure. And any individuality is just an obstacle to that process. Individuality makes it hard for people to understand. There is no community of relatively congenial, you know, I can't think of a good, you know, two professors who even have tangent fields of expertise shared between them. They're highly unlikely to be able to carry on a collegial conversation. You know, and this is even worse in the sciences. Most science journals have been publishing articles that no one is reading. Now one of them made the mistake of taking a survey to see, well, you know, who are we reaching? And it turned out they were publishing articles that had a worldwide readership of 2 or 3. You know, this is how arcane, this is how, I mean, the right term for it, I'm afraid, is idiotic. You know, we have so refined the refined is not right. We have so intensified the specialization that people are subject to, and we've fostered a certain kind of idiosyncratic pattern of preferences, but this does not produce a coherent theory, does not produce, and God knows, certainly not a coherent culture.
Thank you, Phil. Next up is John.
Yeah, say that I agree with some of your criticisms, but I'm not as pessimistic. And I think that one reason why Kant was so popular is because he kind of put the hatchet to metaphysics. So all people, like Nietzsche and these people, adored him. But I think Kant would have been shocked by a person like Hitler, because he did talk about duty, but duty in a sense of seeing man as an end, not as a means. So I think to compare that duty to Eichmann, honestly, I don't think that's correct at all, to Kant. But anyway, my point is that a lot of ideas in philosophy become weapons. And really, there's always a power struggle. And I think we have grown historically. Things have gotten better, despite some horrible things that have happened, like the Holocaust. But things have gotten better. But now we're in a new stage, and we have new tools. And these tools, they're good, like all tools, and bad. And they give powers that people didn't have before. And I think this has to be somehow worked out to a certain point. And I think we're at the early stages where, as you were saying, we're almost like at the rubber baron age, right? Where a few rubber barons are able to control the whole economy. But that's not going to last forever, because nobody owns the internet. Nobody owns the internet. And the thing is, Twitter does not own the internet, and neither does Facebook. And all you need is a few other players to come up, and you can have a de-Google platform. You don't have to rely on Google for your entire internet existence. So I think that, my point is, I'm not as pessimistic. And I think when you reduce everything to knowledge, I mean, that was Plato's thing. Everything was knowledge. Basically, if you're unvirtuous, it's because you didn't have the knowledge, right? And even Socrates, who adored Athens and got killed by Athens, right? And he adored Athens because he had many chances to get out of his death thing, and he chose not to, right? So Plato himself ran a society that didn't turn out too well either. So I don't think that the issue is just, I think you're kind of demeaning, making everybody so ignorant. And also some of the brightest people have done some of the most horrible things. So rationality abused is very dangerous. Rationality abused is very, very dangerous. Matter of fact, some of these doctors that worked with the Nazis, they were no dum-dums. They were extremely smart people. And you talked about eugenics. Aldous Huxley.
They're good. Okay, you're back.
He praised eugenics. Huxley, he's adored as a liberal thinker. He praised eugenics. So your argument with rationality, but everybody becoming dumb and everybody becoming, I don't think that's quite, I just think we need to restore a more fair sense of democracy. We have too few players now having too much power. And that's definitely, we need to restore a certain level of, conversation, which does not exist. Now there are very few voices being heard, right? Right. Anyways, that's my.
Well, okay. There's one point that strikes me as really pertinent, which is to bring Plato and the Greeks into all of this argument. We have to understand, for example, detached knowledge pursued for its own sake, etc. Yes, and there's a sense in which the Greeks believe in that, and especially the rationalist tradition, starting with Parmenides and continue, which is not far, of course, from a form of mysticism. But there's one thing that people miss when they are reading what the Greeks have to say about knowing. Knowing for the Greeks is above all an expression of self-mastery. We don't require, as moderns, that people have accomplished any kind of self-mastery before they set about knowing. Knowing is just an act of the abstracted intellect. And that's why the sciences, the sciences may refer to a kind of ethos that they all participate in as scientists. But this is taken even less seriously than the ethos of attorneys, politicians, etc. one of my favorite tidbits out of the fragments of antiquity, there was a grave, a stone, a headstone, which had an expression of the life philosophy of a gladiator. And it said, "I know that someday I shall cease to know. This does not bother me." Now, what does that mean? It means stoicism. He's bragging about his ice cold mastery over the prospects of life and death. He's saying, I know that I could die, I could cease to be. As precious as life is to anybody, it's certainly precious to him. But he has the clinical detachment from his own self-sentimentality that enables him to dismiss the kind of emotionalisms that move other people. Knowledge is, I mean, in anything you can think of has to be put as a philosophical topic, a cultural issue. It has to be put into an appropriate matrix of the existing subjectivity of the time, and not just personal subjectivity, but the collective web of cultural values. That is the thing that has become threadbare among us. Nietzsche's criticism that we have completely lost all sense of the vital importance of myth. There are issues that are so profound, we can't begin to touch these things with our ordinary language, ordinary thinking. You know, the commonplace utilitarian skills that people develop in order to get through life, in order to deal with other people, these are just not adequate for the kinds of, I mean, every Greek myth has got some tenor of abysmal self-understanding. There are fallacies so profound that they damn the entire soul. They ruin a life a priori just because it's been taken, its delusions have been taken for granted. And the kinds of delusions that people are capable of are so abysmal, you would not have the language. Most people would not have the language to communicate these things to other people. Those issues, therefore, have largely died among us. You know, the things that Joseph Campbell argued had been lost to us from our starving away of the roots of mythical understanding, thinking by analogy, finding stories that move us and that get their moral points across, not by appealing to ordinary contexts, ordinary objective issues, etc. They require a kind of secret knowing or difficult knowing, which is gnosis. It's completely different from intellectual knowing, which is noesis. Our education has nothing to do with that issue of, solving the problem that Nietzsche challenged all of Europe with at the end of the latter part of the 19th century. We have not advanced an inch toward solving it. So, I notice a certain correlation among the people I learned a lot from, the thinkers that I read and gleaned remarkable insights from. There is a certain correlation between the depth at which these people think or thought and the pessimistic conclusions that they arrived at. It's easier to arrive at Pollyanna optimistic perspectives, sentimental Disneyland kinds of orientations. It's easier to arrive at those kind of things if one has a glib orientation toward things. The more probing, the more diagnostic one struggles to be, the more things can be seen to be going wrong, and not just among the the people who are such egregiously bad examples that they're the first things that crop to mind, but the daily news brings us fresh examples of. It's not all grisly, but it is. I was, from the time I was a child, learning to read from the newspapers. I had to ask myself, why do human beings call themselves human if this is the way they're going to treat one another? That kind of thing bothers me. I know there are people who, of course, learn how to read the newspaper completely unmoved. They are as untouched as, ice sculptures by the things that go on around them. It's not my purpose to try and convert anybody, but the things that can be understood from a critical and probing point of view, these are, yes, they are ponderous and gruesome, but the fact that people want a happy ending, they want something to bear out their hopes of how things ought to be. But how things ought to be for most people is just a way that they have been conditioned. Their expectations have been conditioned. It's not an act of free insight, free thinking, etc.
Thank you, John. We're probably going to wrap up at half after, so we'll see if we can get through the remaining people who are in line. Next up is Scott. We have two Scotts, but it's the Scott with his hand up.
I am that very same Scott.
Oh no, there's two Scotts. There's another Scott with his hand up.
It's me.
Oh, okay, excellent. So we have one Scott. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I gathered from the essay is that Kant is worse than Descartes, I guess, because at least Descartes had some material principles that he brought in later on. Kant tried to stay faithful to formal rationality, which has no presuppositions, and he would like to have derived everything from the principle of non-contradiction, but that's too anemic. So he settled for judgment and the unity of the ego, and he tried to produce this an ethics, which is anemic and uninspiring, and the more universal it is, the more abstract it is. It's not satisfying, and it's compatible with all sorts of, with genocide and all these other examples. But aren't you? I don't know which question to ask, but you're using formal reason when you compare these different possible systems, and you decide that a dictatorship by the Aristeia would be the best situation. And surely, and Habermas also, he thinks that pure formal consensus, which is like the social version of contradiction, can be used for policy change when you have a legitimation crisis, when even the dumbest people see that promises are not being kept, and they would, I guess, vote for someone who wouldn't be a liar. And then my real question is, if we can't use reason as a basis for determining our ethics and our policies, are you suggesting that we turn to just tradition or a particular tradition or mythology, biology? Are these our innate hatred for unfairness? Is biology a source for these norms? I guess I agree that we can't use consistency, presuppositionless consistency as a source for norms. But what do you think the source is?
Well, there are several things about what you've said. One is I think you have gotten the relation of Descartes and Kant just about reversed, at least as far as what I am trying to bring out about them. Descartes is an extremely naive and methodologically and culturally unsophisticated, that is what I mean, about what rationality is, what consciousness is, what are we, such that we have these potentialities. Kant has a problem which he is well aware of, namely, he is trying to reason a priori. He is trying to diagnose and analyze what is intelligible about us and our scheme of obligations and principles, what can be understood and resolved from the authority of the integrity of the a priori. We are, this is a vital kind of thing. Kant thinks that the ego, as far as experience, the world of experience is concerned, we are a transcendental principle of the unity of apperception. That is to say, our consciousness is the factor making the world coherent for us. But he's troubled because he understands the limitations of the a priori. The a priori, this is essentially a stumbling block which has been understood as logicism, the belief, the untrammeled belief in or faith in logic. The difficulty being, logic has its binding validity only on the idealities that occur within logic. If we want to apply rationality or logic to anything in actuality, for example, human nature, the relations between human beings, we have a difficulty in that these things are not idealities. We can come up with concepts, with ideas that enable us to draw relationships that either agree with one another or disagree. But beginning with an a priori position, a priori factors, a priori relations, how can this be used to lay out the groundwork for saying things that are more than just analytically true, i.e. tautologically true? Kant he knows he has a problem attaining a synthetic a priori, something that enables him to apply logic to a domain which is not pure logic. That was not a problem that Descartes was aware that he had, because he hadn't framed all these issues in a severe and sufficiently abstract way. So, I mean, logicism, it took, I can't even remember now. I think it took 4 or 5 years of intensive and widespread reading in every philosopher that I get my hands on, every dictionary of philosophy, etc. the existence of logicism as a fallacy, mean, this is essentially, this is philosophy discovering that it's essentially, it's riddled with Murphy's laws. Murphy's laws are the modal contradiction that occurs when people think in terms of purified, intellectualized relations, and then discover the way the real world works. Kant's ethics is extremely cogent. Logic is extremely cogent. There's nothing as cogent besides this. But you know, we've hardly even scratched the surface at this point of what the post-Kantians. I mean, Hegel, especially Hegel, is perhaps the most hammeringly profound critic of this rationalist intellectualism. No, people that Hegel was bedeviled his entire career by the mechanical ways of thinking of the people who taught philosophy, wrote philosophy, reviewed philosophy books. Hegel called this trap of fossilized, mummified mentality, he called it Verstand, which is to say, people who think in a dead, inert form of reason. He believes in the practice of, I mean, the contrast, I think, is well drawn between intellect, which is from the past tense, intellectus, having been understood, having already been understood, and intelligence, which is from the present participle, a gerundive, understanding. Hegel is trying to make use of a kind of existentially applicable, this life, this experience, this individual thing that we're confronted with. The analogy that I make for what Hegel is ultimately trying to do is he's trying to produce a periodic table of elements of the forms and modes of human Geist, spirit or subjectivity. And he has a problem that we don't have any solution for. It's wrong to characterize the essence of what human beings are in terms of mere intellect. But it's also wrong to use religious, abstracted, otherworldly concepts and terms. But that's the choice. We could call, I mean, translations of Hegel's books, Phenomenology of the Mind, and philosophy, you know, the phenomenology of the spirit. These are just, the translators haven't known what to do with Geist. He's trying to get away from both of these fallacious, these are the two prevailing ways of looking at the active inner principle in human essence. And one of them is fallacious because it turns us into something far more rational than we actually are. And the other turns us into something far more supernatural than we actually are. But understanding that, this is the kind of power that Hegel's explanation is, you know, this is the alternative that he tries to produce over against Kant. You know, these issues are far more extensive, far more penetrating than we can frame just looking at Kant.
So the source of principles and norms that ought to govern human life are there in a mysterious ground somewhere, and they percolate through us somehow.
Well,
this is probably what the second talk is going to get into when he covers the material of Hegel and the others.
Well, I mean, it's been aptly said that if our mind were so simple in its structure and operation that we could understand it, it wouldn't be able to do most of the things that we every day take it for granted that it does. We exceed our self-understanding. And thank Geist for that.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to see if we can get through the remaining four people in line before we wrap up tonight. Next in line is
minute
Alex.
apiece.
What's that, Kenneth?
I say 1 minute apiece.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. Next up is Alex.
Hello. So I just wanted to bring up, we were talking about history before, and kind of the idea of like a little bit of what chaos theory brings into things, like an aperiodicity to the patterns kind of going through history, I think is a useful way to frame it. But also just to, two things coming up after that, but to kind of go against a bit of what I feel is kind of like a pessimism. I feel like we've got, the Gulag Archipelago, Man's Search for Meaning. Like we've got some pretty dark books that manage to find the kind of humanity, the beautiful and the tragic, I guess. But going beyond that, I just kind of wondered if you had looked into like Deleuze's What is Philosophy, where he kind of gives up on having a singular understanding of what is human, what is the mind, kind of goes into a tripartite, planes of immanence idea. So especially for this, kind of gives up on rationalism as the only source of knowledge. Like you can't only understand the world through science, and especially the reductionism, which again, kind of going back to the chaos theory. Like we can't predict the weather. Why would we be able to predict our morality or the right choice? The small changes. And then finally, like philosophy as a concept, like we should expect these evolutions in a way, like it's almost aperiodic in itself, meaning that maybe we don't get, Kant if we don't have Descartes. It's kind of like the foundations of that. If Descartes doesn't lay out his own words and those words become dead metaphors for other people to build on, then
well,
that's kind of the whole thing.
I hesitate to use a term like common sense when we're trying to give cautions out about philosophy, but I do recommend taking a kind of medical approach to philosophies. Philosophies, the philosophies are really valuable as specifics, that is, antidotes against some particular kind of limitation or dysfunction or incapacity, whatever. I don't believe in philosophies, the looking at philosophies in terms of a wholesale, absolute either or. Either they're valid or they're invalid, and we either accept them or we refute them or whatever it is we think we're up to. Philosophies are organismically useful. They give us a kind of just like you need a certain kind of vocabulary if you're going to engage in sports or if you're going to do art or whatever. That those vocabularies are they're really the tools of your mind by which you lay out the a priori, in a way, you lay out the logic of that domain that you're trying to work in. The you know, Nietzsche said that philosophies are really just clandestine autobiographies. Every thinker is really trying to deal with his own problems, and they're his problems. And I guess, you know, thank goodness for that, because it's, you know, it's as if he had a life or death struggle. He needs to master these issues, or something in him is just going to wither and perish. You know, it's obvious to me there are human beings who are, as far as I'm concerned, less than human, because they have not come to terms with Kant's categorical imperative. They are bigots. They are, you know, they have so encumbered their personalities that they cannot rise to the level of taking a rational point of view on the problems of living in society, of, you know, we're no longer primitive communities. We're not tribes. Some people would like it if we were, because they know how to manipulate people at a tribal level. And people who have nothing in their intelligence or their critical resources beyond those tribal emotionalisms of love and hate and exclusion and inclusion, you know, that kind of thing. That is a very simple, very primitive mode in terms of which some people have their whole existence organized, not by them. That's the way their existence clamped onto the formation of their personality. My favorite of ancient philosophers is certainly going to be Heraclitus. He is just a marvel of the art of excavating mysteries. And he says we don't know what he's talking about, because the word that he uses does not occur that often in Greek writings of that period. He says that something, and it might be anger, it might be bigotry. I'm inclined to think he's talking about bigotry. He speaks of this as the sacred disease. And the reason it's a sacred disease is no human being having a choice to make would be capable of making himself into a bigot. Being a bigot is an abysmal, profound affliction. It is, I mean, if anything is fated, this surely must qualify in personality structures. And, you know, the unthinkability, the fact that its effect is total. I mean, there are people who try to be Christians and they just can't Christianize every part of their appetites and greed and other vices and so on. There are people who try to be good sports or whatever, and there's something that they can't quite digest into the sports ethos. You know, the idea that you attach yourself, I mean, you attach yourself to something, and it might be the military code. It might be the partisan politics of a particular political movement. Totally formatting oneself according to a single-minded, total point of view. That's damn difficult, if not impossible. The harder one tries, the more one has to work at it, the less successful one is at achieving a unitary structure, because you're always suspicious. There's something in you that did not get uprooted, that needed to be cast out. But bigotry is a monstrously single-minded orientation. Sometimes it happens that people think they are bigoted. They try to live that kind of life. Everybody around them is that way. And eventually they discover they just don't believe this bullshit. And they cast it aside, and they discover, there was nothing but some completely extraneous conditioning that was making them conform to the patterns of bigotry of the rest of their community or tribe or whatever. Heraclitus perceives there's an enormous problem here. Bigotry is an accomplishment too great for finite human will. It's like a cancer. It's a totally self-consuming. It is a totalitarian mentality. Just within the one, everything has got to be related to this inflammatory issue. There's nothing that it doesn't touch upon. I mean, if you can't do anything about people like that, is this any different from someone being insane, being having wrecked their mind with psychedelics or what have you, or they're people who make themselves incompetent to deal with the real world and with other people. And if we had the kinds of criteria that the ancient Athenians had, we would be excluding a hell of a lot more people from participating in public affairs. And it wouldn't be because the color of their skin, but because their mentality has a demented optic to it. I was once called for jury duty, and when the judge found out that I had taught at universities and that I taught philosophy, he was interested to learn this, and the bailiff came and drew me back in to the courtroom after we were released for lunch. The judge had an issue. He was arguing with another judge, and they wondered why Rousseau had such a radically different concept of citizenship from Aristotle. And I gave him a very simple, to the point answer, because Rousseau does not have a character test for citizenship. No modern state really does, but the Greeks did. They had a temple dedicated to Ares, where a council met every week, the Areopagitica, and it weighed for public consideration the particular actions and words that people had said during the passing previous week. They weighed whether these things were really fitting for Athenian culture. That's a character test. Someone was at risk, perhaps, of being ostracized, exiled for a period of whatever it was, a year or 5 years. And he might have his property confiscated if he was not a fit citizen. That's a people that took seriously dimensions of ethics and duty that we don't even think are duties. We are a nation of civilians compared with that nation of soldiers, believers. This is not a matter of dictatorial order. It's just a matter of guaranteeing that the people who say that they are patriots really are and aren't just bullshitting you the way most people who use that expression have come to use. They just they want you to lay off of them. Don't look too close. We're all just patriots here. No, we aren't. Some of us are traitors. And this is the perfect environment for traders to pass unobserved and undetected in, because there's no critical examination. There are no criteria. Okay. More.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Next up is Oded.
Hi. Oh, okay. Actually, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just engineer. Last name is Learner, so still try to learn. Now I'm 80. So now I introduce myself. Now I'm making my main issue is culture or global philosophy. The Greek speak Greek. We translate it to English, and we understand what the philosopher say via the perception of the translator. All the Far East and Middle East, like Chinese and Hebrew, don't speak in like English in words, they speak in idea or concept. That means if you want to be more focused, they put several concepts or idea, and when all these concepts merge is the word. We do that in the Western culture or the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-German culture, we use word. That means you see the word not as a big picture, but as a big board with many, many holes. Each of them focus on one point. So when the presenter wants to say idea, you have to use many, many words because you can't see the whole idea. And I think this will cause problem when translating from one language to another, when we may lose the content. I would call it lost in translation. And this is one element that I want to say about philosophy that make me wondering all the time, because I'm thinking in idea, my language is Hebrew, which is different than English. The way of thinking altogether, not just the words, but the way of thinking. Secondly is time. Today we say Wall Street as a negative expression. 50 years ago, Wall Street may be just a location in New York City. Now we put a meaning for a word, making from a word which is very limited, we try to expand it to idea. But the problem with those ideas, they are time limited. In 20 years from now, maybe Wall Street will not have no meaning again, and be just kind of forgotten street in New York City. In this case, because of we have this problem, we in Anglo-Saxon, called the Western culture, we create all the time more and more word in philosophy, because we want to, in one hand, to widen our spectrum of thinking, but you don't change the tool with style. Instead of getting that, we have many holes to look at the big picture. Why philosophy don't create kind of a more wide range philosophical expression that can give us more highlighting than just what you do now? Because I'm sitting now in this meeting, I'm not philosopher, I'm an engineer, and I try to get what is all this word that been used mean for me. I can't use dictionary all the time. That means sometimes philosophy is for philosopher only, and this is not the idea. The idea of philosophy is for the mass, not for the philosopher only. I think my 2 minutes is over, long time ago.
Well, I quite agree that the ethnocentrism of language dogs everyone who tries to understand. I mean, even if you try to understand, Wittgenstein, who wrote in English as well as in German, to understand a key idea, a pivotal factor in an argument. It is just about as difficult to translate philosophy from language to language as poetry. It is hard to capture. I mean, some languages may have superfluous connotations. Languages go through historical changes such that, you know, in one age, they have a lot more resonance, and people can see the connection between the different aspects of some concept. And in another age, these things fragment. The same concept begins to mean something, on the one hand, mystical. You'll get a mystical sect coming out of this. Neoplatonism, for example, the idea of the good, and so forth. The power of, you know, I don't know how to, it takes it takes a marriage of two different kinds of genius in the same person to be able to, on the one hand, be open to the whole organism of an idea and not just some obvious aspects of it. You know, on the one hand, one has to be able to suspect that there must be something more to this idea if the little fragments that I can translate into English don't quite make as resonant a form of sense. I mean, it takes a lifelong devotion to mastering a particular language to be able to read all those subliminal hidden elements. And I hate to say it, but, you know, again, American education is just failing Americans. The next, you know, it's been failing the next generation since the 1960s. We're losing, you know, in the first place, no one is really learning how to write essays in the ordinary course of an American education, but everyone should. This is the way people figure out what they believe, how they feel, etc. The whole subjective dimension. I mean, for the lack of that kind of education, people turn into objectifying meatheads. You know, Americans are really handicapped when it comes to their access to other languages, other historical ages, etc. No age has got a monopoly on the most vital issues. And certainly we would be the least likely of all cultures to have such a mastery or a monopoly, because we are more ethnocentric, we're more myopic. I mean, I learned a lot from the foreign professors, foreign students. And I hate to say it, but in some cases I learned more about English than I had learned in the courses in English that I'd taken. There's some peculiarities of English that English speakers and writers are completely oblivious to. And if you see someone or hear someone, you know, attempting to formulate something, and it seems awkward, you know, well, sometimes awkward is what you get when you try to make a language to capture two different aspects of a concept at the same time. So, well, there was much more in what you asked, and I rather fear I've lost some of the things I wanted to say.
Well, we'll have next time to come back with more questions and,
Yes.
and dig more deeply. As we're approaching the end of our session, let's see if we can get our last two people in line in. Thank you, Oded. Next up is Garth.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
we can.
Okay, good. I wanted to say, I think like our way of thinking about ethics, especially the Kantian way, is really missing several dimensions. And this ethics, I think, inevitably leads to fascism. I think ethics really needs some account of emotions, individual needs, especially aesthetics like beauty and diversity. But if we just focus on pure deontology, then it doesn't really work for anything. And you know, people encounter things like people that are outside of the ethical framework, like people doing things that appear unethical to them. And how do they deal with that within the Kantian framework? Are you just supposed to turn the other cheek when somebody slaps you? It's ridiculous, to be honest. And so it leads to this very fascistic way of thinking where everything has to be according to some rule. Like, you know, if your wife forgets to buy more canned tomatoes, then you've got to berate her for that because, you know, you're supposed to put it on the shopping list and that kind of thing. And that's just the way so many people think these days. And like the way our research has gone in all social science disciplines is sort of chasing down these bizarre ways of thinking to their end, but there is no end. Like you can look at economics. So much ink has been spilled towards arguing not to give poor people bread. And the theories in economics are completely ridiculous. Look at the life cycle hypothesis, the idea that rich people will spend all their money before they die. Have you ever met a rich person who didn't bequeath millions of dollars to their children? You know, there's an element of research, then there's an element of accepted doctrine, but there's also the element of ignored doctrine. I recently read Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. You know, where is all the wealth in our economy coming from? Well, it's coming from rents, you know, people that already own something. And this has completely warped culture over time. Like the age before World War I was the age of extreme income inequality. And if we live in a society where all the resources are passed on from wealthy parents to wealthy children, then we've created a caste system. And why should we expect to have anything but fascism eventually result from that?
Well, I hearken back to Marx in relation to this, because Marx's argument is that money and capital are dead labor. That is labor that's been, the energy of labor has been expended in order to produce something that will keep. And they try to preserve food. They put money and invested in forms where it's, you know, making the most profit as an investment. That argument is very cogent in the sense that what prevails over formalized, scientized economies is abstract principles of calculation. And of course, from the standpoint of money and capital and whatnot, giving people money to buy food to keep their kids alive, that's a waste of money. Kids are not a value. Money is a value. Money is the, I've many times said, there are people who, if money and the idea of money had never been invented, they would have no concept how to evaluate things. This is all they have for a value, an evaluative structure. Money is so apt for this type of personality that it militarizes, it regiments these people. They are ready and ripe for the kind of mercenary culture that owns precisely the most potent strata of wealth and power. eventually the whole economy gets deformed, and the society as well. How, you know, to what extent is society still a society? Has it not increasingly become just an organ of the economy? It's a doctrine called economism, that the human dimensions have been thoroughly subordinated to something that is not only not human, it's not living at all. And increasingly, as the concentrated family wealth confronts the alienation, the culture conflict, the babble of values in modern, especially late modern society, people who are people whose whole existence is invested in the propagation of profit have less and less ability to communicate those quote unquote values to the next generation. They don't trust the next generation. The last thing in the world they're going to do is permit the next generation to get their hands on the family boodle. And therefore, I mean, there have been a number of interesting articles written about this. More and more fortunes are getting invested. I can't remember the terminology for all of this anymore, but more and more fortunes are getting invested in such a form that the dead hand of the original fortune maker this is somebody who has passed away generations ago and still will be ruling that family wealth for the foreseeable centuries. This is you talk about the dead hand, really a kind of zombieism is operating at the highest level. I mean, why can't we divest from fossil fuels? Because dead hands are at work here. Decisions that were made centuries ago, practically. Now this calls for special federal legislation to invalidate these kinds of covenants. But it's not going to happen because the federal government happens to be entirely in the grips of exactly those, not just those people, but the servants, the operatives who are dedicated to fostering their interests. I mean, the world is locked into a logic of who and what should rule. And if we have a choice about returning this planet to a habitable mode, a temperate climate, it will have to be somehow in spite of institutionalized structures like that. So, issues of ethics, issues of values. We have enough problems just from the crass materialism this is the only language that is shared by many spheres of our social system. And it is immured against interference. It has complete impunity as far as committing crimes against the future. But, well, I probably had other things to say. We still have another Another person in the docket?
Yes, yes. Thank you for that, Garth. And we turn now to our final question of the evening before we wrap up. Donald, go ahead.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to say hi to Kenneth.
This is a damned expensive way to do it.
Yeah, well, when I show up in Austin, you'll know that we've had our vaccinations.
Oh,
we'll
good.
soon be back on the road and spreading death. But,
oh God!
Via the tailpipe?
Maybe. But I did want to emphasize, based on some responses by people here, that when you talk about the douloi and the bonosoi and the aristoi, you're pretty much, from your other writings, I think, talking about character types that help us understand situations in our own society. You're not talking about, when you talk about douloi, that we need an institution of slavery in order to place them properly. Payday loan services and whatnot will place them properly. Those with slavish characters will find a master, and they won't have to look far.
That's right. We have to be setting limits of what is acceptable form in all of these matters. The ancient Greeks had these problems. Things reached a point where there were, primarily from warfare, family fortunes were getting decimated, people were getting ruined, etc. And people who previously had been taken care of within the nurture of the household, they were cast adrift to fend for themselves in the market. And I hypothesize this is where Aesop comes from. Aesop found animal fables like converting things into cartoons that slaves could comprehend with the poverty of folkish culture that they had. They could be brought to some level of sophistication by these stories. I mean, we're seeing a graphic example of slave psychology, slave culture. I mean, it's not far from Uncle Remus. It is Uncle Remus. It's the folk tales of the African peoples being adapted to new circumstances, and they're heroes. I mean, people that finds a hero in a trickster figure, Brer Rabbit, etc. So I think you were going to ask something more.
That's enough. We can all. It's been 3 hours, and in spite of having,
not a bad idea.
In spite of having spent almost 50 years as a computer programmer, engineer, science, whatever, this was also my first use of teleconferencing, video conferencing, and whatever. I got quite used to building sophisticated equipment, but not very good at using it.
Well, it would have made life so much more complicated. Just like me. I mean, you release a philosophy book or a paper into the world. It's like putting a message in a bottle and tossing it in the Gulf Stream. So,
well, you better do that soon, because the Gulf Stream is scheduled to stop here within the next few years.
Oh heavens! I would have known better to bring that up if I'd taken the time to read the paper today.
So I trust David Roll, you'll work with Kenneth to schedule part 2 of this to go through the second half of the paper.
Yeah, I think I'm going to do it a posteriori instead of a priori. I'm going to write it first and then we'll announce that it's ready. Because the other way is certainly hell on wheels. Yes. Well, thank you all. I've had a great time. I hope you enjoyed at least little particles of it. Philosophy is basically for masochists, and you know, we do what we can.
You got to really want to push that boulder uphill.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for being here, Kenneth, and we look forward to the next time.
Al, thank you. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Hope you enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everyone.